Our policies are dominated by very powerful narratives. The powerful narrative that says that Africans cannot produce their food, they need agrochemicals to produce their food, they need genetically modified food to produce their food. Land in the hands of Africans is not productive, so we have to give it to somebody else. Policy comes from capital cities, people don't know, they are there to be directed, all those things. And so many things cooked out of the continent that are coming to Africa, and the level of influence that we are experiencing from all over, that shocks me. The difference between regenerative and others is emphasis. Agroecology emphasizes a social movement. Regeneration implies is that if you get to an area and do soil and water conservation, planting and water and whatever, if a barren area becomes a forest, and it has regenerated. In general, in principle, I don't see emphasis on social movements that much, emphasis on the critics of power that much. So our difference is in the political side of it. It is messing us up. So many of the policies in Africa are influenced by USAID now. For example, an acceptance of agrochemicals, acceptance of GMOs. So this is an agent of the US government, an agent of so many US companies that we Africans don't want. Agroecology is very clear. It says there are three legs which are a basis for agroecology, like an African stool, The one is practices, mulching, compost, all that. The second is science. Now we are increasingly emphasizing participatory action research as a research also. But there are number of sciences, almost all fields. The third, which is equally important, is social movement.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special podcast episode. I'm your host, the Organic Guy, and today I'm co-hosting this podcast with Koen from Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food Podcast. This podcast episode is a special, because it's a conversation that is part of our new series that we're calling the African Regenerative Frontrunners, a collaboration between the Organic Guy podcast and the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and the Food podcast, with the support of Rootical, which is a regenerative venture studio that is based right here in East Africa. The aim of this series is really simple: to bring African regenerative voices to the global stage and to facilitate conversations that will be shaping the future of food and agriculture. And today's guest is one of those voices. Million Belay is the co-founder and the general coordinator of Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, in short AFSA, which is the largest in the African continent in terms of advocating for agroecology, indigenous knowledge, and food sovereignty. For more than 20 years, he has been working at the crossroads of ecology, culture, and African food systems transformation. So I'm super excited for this conversation because, we might not be talking only about farming, but I think by a larger extent about the Africa future food systems. So Million, thank you very much for making time for the podcast, and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Brian, for the intro. I'm Koen van Seijen, and I'm the co-host here, and I get the great honor to kick it off with a question we always like to ask, because in our podcast, because let's say there are easier career paths in the world than to focus on food sovereignty, agroecology, regeneration, and farming. And so we love to ask this question: how comes you spend most of your waking hours thinking, acting around this theme? Why this one and not something else, something easier potentially?
I think it's not by design. It's a natural progression. I was working on environmental issues when I was a high school teacher. Later in my life, I was involved in environmental issues also in the park and whatever. Later, I started to work with the African Biodiversity Network and the continental context, and I started to move into the cultural sphere. And we had a number of connections with globally, especially with indigenous people in Colombia, Brazil, and whatever. So when I started Melka Ethiopia, the local NGO, We started to work with farmers, food system. Later on, we felt that I think as the majority of Africans, in some countries, like including my country, Ethiopia, since more than 80% of the people, the population, farmer or they getting their business from farming. In African economy, over 45%, and some even higher, depending on farming. And the rapid erosion of also the cultural food of Africa. That told us all that food is a very important issue. So we need also to focus on that. I think also because of outside domination, we are losing so much of what we have, but what we still have is our food system. So yeah, it's a natural progression. It's not a choice.
Just to ask a follow-up one, you could still have chosen, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, obviously, very, very rationally, let's say. But then when coming from the environmental space and going into the food systems, into the agriculture space, into like sovereignty, what surprised you the most? Or how was that? Like, it's a natural transition, as you explain it, it seems very logical, but still it's a choice to lean into that and not focus mostly on energy systems or waste systems, or which are all adjacent but very different. Like, how was that stepping into the food space and agriculture space with both feet, let's say?
I think the big surprise for me, yeah, still, I cannot say that I'm out of that, is how much our thinking, even in our social conversation space, and our policies are dominated by very powerful narratives. The powerful narrative that says that Africans cannot produce their food, they need agrochemicals to produce their food, they need genetically modified food to produce their food. Land in the hands of Africans is not productive, so we have to give it to somebody else. Policy comes from capital cities, people don't know. They are there to be directed, all those things. And so many things cooked out of the continent that are coming to Africa. And yeah, the level of influence that we are experiencing from all over, that shocked me, it still shocks me.
Yeah, I can imagine, yeah, what you're talking about, and especially the kind of narratives that are being thrown in front of our eyes. But the good thing is, you are doing something about it, and I think you came out and established AFSA, which is one of the largest organizations that are really trying to push agroecology and sort of how we can protect indigenous farmers as well. So what was the idea behind it? Like, what inspired you to sort of say, what, I think we need AFSA in the African continent?
I think around 2000, we started the African Biodiversity Network in 2002. So the later years, I mean 2003, 4, 5, we felt that we cannot achieve what we want to achieve as a separate network. We need to bring other networks to work with us as African Biodiversity Network. Because the issue, the agenda is much more than one single network. And second, I think we realize that I think if we could create a network and do our own research, do our own analysis, and do our own advocacy, I think we can get somewhere. And we couldn't find any other actor. There are so many local level civil society organizations, farmer, fisher folks, and whatever. But there was a gap, a huge gap, which is an organization which can learn and synthesize and mobilize, knowledge in local groups and challenge the domination that is coming through the African Union. There are very, very critical actors who are influencing or are still keep on influencing the African Union in the food system agenda. But there is very, very, it's almost nobody with a voice of the multitude of Africans who can be a voice in both in international spaces and in the local space, and a voice which can be genuine, authentically African, which can be respected by the international civil society groups and can work also with them, which can be open, which can learn. So we needed something to create an authentic group, an African group. That's what is the drive basically. So four other networks came on 2008. Then 2009 we came to Addis Ababa, and there were 13 networks by then, and we coined the name AFSA while we were there. So the main thing is just we just wanted to create something as Africans, so then it was possible.
Yeah, and I guess in hindsight, it sort of now makes sense. No, I'm wondering in terms of like what brought all these organizations together. Like, what kind of vision did you sell to them? Because I'm thinking you have organizations from West Africa, from Southern Africa, from here in East Africa, all dealing with trying to solve different issues. So, what was your pitch to them, and why do you think they agreed to be part of AFSA?
I think the majority of them came voluntarily, without us asking them to join us and whatever. And some of them we know, were invited at the initial stage. But there were some kind of principles, farmers should be leaders. A group who believe in that. A group who believe that genetically modified organisms are not good. A group who believe that intellectual property rights in food systems, on the seed speakle is wrong. A group who believes that we can have an agricultural system without chemicals. By then, the name agroecology was not that much featuring. Even in 2013, when we decided to really prove for ourselves, whether agroecology works in Africa or not, very few groups working on it, but there were a number of actors on organic agriculture, that form of agriculture, but not on agroecology. So that is it. The main drive is what can we do together. And if we look at the first statement that we produced in Addis Ababa in 2009, like the Addis Ababa Declaration, it has some food and agricultural elements, and it has also some environmental elements there. Also, the issue of environment was also there. I think it was also inspired by the African giants, like Dr. Tolde Brand Gabriel from Ethiopia, Professor Ekpere from Nigeria, and a number of people. They were influential people in the field of biodiversity, people who have influenced the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Cartagena Protocol, African groups, yeah, the farmers' rights agenda, So they were behind us. They were groups. They were giant individuals which were advising us, which were also looking at what we are doing and also, influencing. But yeah, these were the issues and the sticking points among us. Yeah.
As a follow-up question or a question in that sense, what you've seen change as well over the last decades in Africa on the continent. You say there's a lot of outside influence. One of those influence is money for sure, and investment capital with all the tensions that bring. We love to ask this question in a different way. We all know the issues with outside capital, but if there's a message you can give to investors, people that are managing their own wealth or other people's wealth. Let's say we do this in the financial capital of Ethiopia in a nice theater. I like to do this not online, but like in person. And we're on stage. Of course, we had a great meal, a lot of interesting, let's say, visual imagery behind, a lot of interesting for many people. Maybe it's one of those, they have very strong narratives in their head around chemicals, around feeding the world. And let's say in that evening, we try to dismantle some of those. But also people forget. The next day, they're at their laptop, they're at their computer, they're at work. What would be one thing you want investors, financially focused people to remember from an evening like that? If we host an evening around agroecology and finance partly, what would be one seed you want to plant in the mind of people that they won't forget or can't forget anymore?
Probably what I would encourage them to look at. I don't know whether I would be answering your question in a brilliant way, but I think one of the agenda is the climate. Everybody hopefully understands and feels the impact of the climate crisis, and also the food crisis that we are experiencing in terms of health. I think the health agenda is everybody's agenda. So, question is, what will take us out of this crisis? What will take us? What's the best way? What can tick most of the boxes? I think for us, it's agroecology. It heals nature. Agroecology heals nature, brings people together, helps revive relationship among communities, and the food that's produced also is healthy. But you are asking about investment, you know. So when people say, okay, that's for the farmers, what about in terms of investment? I think if people look at the statistics in Europe, in the USA and whatever, the share of, I think let's take organic agriculture as an indication and organically produced food. The share of organically produced food is increasing. People are opting for healthy food. Wherever the food comes from, people will be happy to eat healthy food. So investment in healthy food, healthy produced food, produced without harming the environment, without chemicals, will pay in the end. It will pay for the environment, it will pay for the local communities, and it's also profitable at the end of the day for whoever invests on it.
To reverse that question, or to reverse the tables, let's say somehow, and I'm not saying anyone should have this kind of concentrated wealth, but let's say it happens tomorrow morning, a faraway relative you never knew sadly passed away, and a lot of money ended up in your bank account. And we usually ask the question, what would you do with $1 billion or €1 billion or whatever currency, but like an insane amount of money, but you had to put it to work. And I'm not asking for exact amounts, but I'm asking what would be main buckets, main, let's say, focus areas if suddenly financial resources was no constraint, which again, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but let's say it happens. If you had to put $1 billion to work, what would you do? What would you focus on?
I think I will focus it on youth in a project which can give them hope. I think the food system is a very interesting space because there is a lot of work there. We are only looking at the food production side of it, but in harvesting, in processing, in packaging, in marketing, and consumer, in converting food waste to something more. It's a lot of work in between. Yeah, there is a lot of cultural and economical activities around that. So I would invest it, in an area where we can see change, so that others also emulate. But I will do it. There's so many projects that are failed in Africa, and I sometimes say that Africa is a graveyard of so many projects, well-meaning, but the main problem is they assume they have an assumption that since their idea is beautiful and whatever, then it can work. And their main problem is it doesn't start from consulting local people. I know that's a very difficult process, messy. Participation is not easy. But that is a way. You have to bring it in, bring people in, and there's a number of methodologies which you can use to do that. So I wouldn't rush to spend the money, but I will take time to really bring people up, to really understand. But I will invest it in news, invest in new system, in the food system, and hopefully I will take so many out of where they are, and I'll make the continent much happier continent.
Yeah, that's a really really interesting way to spend the money, and something that you mentioned that sometimes actually gets flipped for the sustainable farming system is, yeah, it's well-meaning, but can you feed the world, right? So that's one of the things that is always thrown at the sustainable farming movement. But earlier you mentioned that when you were starting, agroecology was not really a thing in 2013. Organic was sort of mentioned in there, and now we have regenerative agriculture, which is actually one of the titles we've given this series, the African Regenerative Frontrunners. So I'm thinking, like, from your perspective, when you're looking at these farming systems, do you see a difference in each of these farming system, or you sort of see them as one part of like the sustainable farming movement?
Yeah, I mean the difference between the regenerative and others probably is emphasis. Agroecology emphasizes a social movement. It critiques the current food system. Our understanding that the problem that we have in the food system is not technical. It cannot address by reviving the soil or making sure that an area which was dry gets water. What regeneration implies is that if you get to an area and do soil and water conservation, planting, and water and whatever, if a barren area becomes a forest, and it has regenerated, which is a lofty purpose. But the emphasis, I'm saying emphasis because I know the founders or the originators of the regenerative idea, the head of the global network of regenerative agriculture, Andre Liu, is a friend. You know, we talk quite a lot together, and I know he's political. You know, I was invited into during the first conference of starting of regenerative alliance group also. Yeah, I know so many actors in the regenerative movement who do also criticize the political side, the power relationship, whatever. I know, but in general, in principle, the way I understand it also, I don't see emphasis on social movements that much, emphasis on the critics of power that much. Agroecology is very clear. It says there are three legs, which are a basis for agroecology, like an African stool. The one is the practices, soil and water conservation, mulching, compost, all that. The second is science. Now we are increasingly emphasizing participatory active research as a research also. But there are number of sciences, almost all fields. The third, which is equally important, is social movement. Why social movement? One, the world food system is controlled by a few actors. You can go to any side of it and look at any statistics, and that's what you see. Few and fewer and fewer and fewer companies are controlling our food system. Now, ultra processed food is a typical example when few companies control the food system and they feed you actually poison and they make you deliberately addicted to that food. And now there is no question that this is a killer kind of food. So we critique that. The second thing is in the policy environment, in so many things, the voices of people is marginalized. The CADAP policy process here in Africa, what has happened with African Union. You know what I was writing that time, with CADAP, we were fighting with CADAP, and that policy making process in our country was in our continent and in so many of African countries is controlled by the few, by this powerful, and there is no voice, genuine voice. They will have probably one pastoralist, one farmer participating, and he raises his hand. No, no, farmers should be. They take this as a participation. You see, so there is no genuine participation of local people in the policy making process in decisions that affect their life. Women, youth, you can bring all those people together. And third, and finally, is there is a need of bridging the gap that exists among social movements. There are a number of social movements all over in Africa and globally. Even in Europe, there are a number of social, really well-meaning movements, and in the US also, there are really so many movements. So we have to come together. So because of these three reasons, we cannot change our food system without social movement. So that is an equal emphasis with research and with practices. That's where the difference is.
And to ask a question on that, even though it's let's say it's a magical question, or it's a question where it's not, let's say, immediately possible, but let's say it is. If there was one thing you would change, I know there are 2,000 things to change in the food system, but if there was only one thing, like tomorrow morning, but it could be anything from policy changes to global consciousness to banning ultra processed food. We've heard them all. Not we've heard them all. We've heard the full spectrum, let's say, of things. All animals have to be outside. People taste better food. Anything could work. But if there's only one thing you can change in the food system, if you had a magic wand, what would that be? What would be the one thing you would change tomorrow morning?
It's a very difficult question, because there is no one thing, that everything is related. It's one of those problems which they call, I forgot the name, very messy problems, When you change one thing, there is another one, there is another one, there is another one, they are very much intertwined, But probably things would start by having a proper kind of direction, an agreed direction among all of the actors which are very much important on where the direction of our food system should go. And to agroecology, that will give sign to so many things, and that will change so many things, I'm afraid that maybe that's not the only solution, so many things, but if I have to choose, I'll go for that.
It does make sense because we have a lot of problems and I'm sure they require a lot of solutions as well. So that makes sense. So you mentioned a little bit earlier about the progress that you've seen since you started AFSA back in 2013 to now. So I'm wondering, like, from your perspective, you can just scale it down like to Ethiopia where you are. Can you see the difference in terms of farmers who have adopted, let's say, regenerative or agroecology practices? Have you seen their lives improve or like their farming improve? What are you picking from the ground? Like, what are some of the examples you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you so many examples from all over the continent. What they say that they have improved, I think they have food every year, because in an agroecological farm, different foods mature at different time, so there is no hunger. The second is there is no limitation of knowledge or practice, as you know. Some people kind of get agroecology wrong, and they say that it's going back. But nobody is romanticizing how agriculture is happening in the continent. In Africa. I know some. They say, oh no, farmers have their own seed, their own leave them, kind of thing. But the science part of agroecology emphasizes that there's always things to improve in the way you do things. So you bring in farmers in with the discussion, they would add other actions that they're doing. So we have had so many farmers who are doing, for example, vermicompost. That's not the culture of Africa. It has come in. You go to so many farms, you find that now. I mean, I was in a conference sitting, and somebody was talking about that methodology and how that changes, the whole farming system is incredible. So there are so many things, and I've seen some farms where that is implied I mean, implemented, and where there are changes. The signs are everywhere, and we have taken government people to see those places, so those changes, and the change in policy in Africa is getting rapid. I mean, faster now.
You just said we see policy changing quicker as well. Do you have some positive stories, of course, of the work you did? We are trying really hard in Brussels to change one of the largest subsidy systems in the world on farming, which is not easy. The US is attempting similar things with the Farm Bill. Do you have some lessons learned and some insights in how on the African continent some policies have been changing to favor actual forward-thinking agroecology farmers and not just the large agro-industry?
The best example is Kenya. And Kenya, they have 47 counties. County after county after county after county is producing an agroecology policy. incredibly. The first county, I think it's Moringa County, and what they have done is incredible. They produce the policy, the structure, I mean, the strategy. After that, they made it a plan, and they budgeted it, and they start to implement it. All of the questions that you would ask to make sure that what their policy is implemented. What makes this very much interesting is if you are looking for any country where there are a lot of interests and contradictions, Kenya is also the best example. The president of the country is for GMOs, for industrial agriculture and whatever. But then they have an agroecology strategy as a country, and county after county is producing an agroecology policy. And what is good, what's best is they can go to the country beside them and can learn how to implement that policy into the practice. Uganda is preparing, Tanzania has an agroecology policy, Ethiopia has an agroecology policy. You know what is important though? Governments, they're good in producing policies. Maybe a funder has come, one funder, mostly GIZ or something now, I think in the case of some countries, and they give them the money, they pay for organization of different conferences, workshops, and finally, because of that interest in whatever, then and the civil society comes together, agroecology, okay, that's your document, But implementing it is another totally different story. So where do you stand as a civil society, as a farmer group? That's why AFSA as a group, and me personally also, are pushing for country level social movement. That is a bedrock of social movement, you see. Otherwise, we can be really good as a continental network. And we're trying to be that. But if there is no movement at the country level, I think things will not work. So the social movements at the country level should pressurize the government to implement those policies. And funders are actors. I think the good thing about agroecology is almost every European NGOs and whatever NGOs that I know are endorsing agroecology. So this is a very good sign. So what we should do now is how do you what is it on ground? Because the beauty of it and the challenge of it at the same time for agroecology, it's contextual. It's very difficult to graft one kind of agroecology into another one. That's very, very difficult. So we need to understand it.
And does this replace, like these policies and the strategies, do they replace, is that the agriculture policy then, or is it like a side one? And is there also an industrial one?
That's a very good observation. They can have they can have two, three policies which can contradict, If these two policies found themselves on a desk of somebody, they can have a karate competition among themselves. No, I agree with you. That's why now what we are pushing is for a food policy. A food policy is not necessarily an agricultural policy. Food is economics, it's water, it's health, it is international relationship, it's everything. It's every minister. So you have one food policy, but every sectoral offices do contribute for that. Then you have a mechanism of creating harmony among the policy implementation at the country level.
Yeah, I found it fascinating, and I think I was reading one of your pieces that you wrote on LinkedIn, and one of them was about USAID. You were very categorical in terms of saying, yeah, actually, the fact that the US no longer supports USAID can be a good thing for African food systems. So why did you decide to take approach?
You said he's messing us up. I know that there is no organization which is 100% bad, and even in agriculture, I was told later on that they were supporting some good projects here and there, but mainly. I can give you three examples. One example is the revision of biosafety policies. So personally, I was present at the three meetings, two meetings, regional meetings at Africa level, one in Ethiopia, where a representative of USAID was sitting. They're not saying anything. They are funding the meeting, and there are people who are prepared already, local people. But they were sitting and listening and observing and whatever. So many of the policies in Africa. That's my second point. So many of the policies in Africa are influenced by USAID now. And also the US government, through direct bilateral relationships, they do influence a number of policies. For example, UPOV 91, I hope you have seen my podcasts. The first four podcasts are on UPOV 91. I think I advise anybody who is interested on seed issues in Africa to follow those podcasts. The name of the podcast is called "The Battle for African Agriculture." And one thing that was coming from those podcasts, from my interviews with experts in the field, that during bilateral relationships, the acceptance of UPOV 91 is put there. An acceptance of agrochemicals, acceptance of GMOs. So this is an agent of the US government, an agent of so many US companies that we Africans don't want. So they will be coming in a different way with a different actor. We're going to see what will be the focus of this US government. We're going to see. But my personal experience is good reading. But I know that so many people have lost their jobs. I do feel it. Sometimes a husband and a wife from the same family, husband working with one organization, a wife, and that would be disaster. The health system was so much dependence, but why should we relax ourselves and get depend on these actors? So it's a good shock into the system also.
And we'll definitely put the podcast in the show notes. And as a final question, which is never a final question because then there will be others to follow up. But this switch, or not the switch, but the focus on the food system, do you see that landing better or getting more, resonating more? We see slowly some signs in Europe and elsewhere as well, where of course the health system is under huge pressure. Let's say somehow food, and in our areas, of course, less people are working the land and farming the land. So food is much more, touches many more people daily than agriculture in that sense. And it seems that talking about the food system and how it connects to everything else is a better strategy or a more successful or resonating strategy than talking about agriculture should be different. Is that the same? Do you see that the same, like on government levels, policy, companies, farmers, that focusing on food instead of only agriculture and farmers works?
I think it's beginning to be understood what a food system is. There are a different way of understanding of that. Some people understand it as production, harvesting, processing, marketing. This linear travel of food, but that's not food system. There are a number of actors around those food systems. It rests on the ecological reality of the situation. There's a gender issue, there's cultural issue. There are so many things around the food system agenda. But in terms of politics, you see, a word for a negotiator, international negotiator, is very much meaningful. For example, one Kenyan climate negotiator, he said, no, he doesn't want food system in the climate negotiation. I said, oh, really? Why? He said that if you put the food system in the climate negotiations, if you agree, then they would come back and they started to look at not only your food production, but your food processing, your food marketing. You're open up to so many challenges. So as a country, as a continent, there are so many challenges everywhere. Agreeing on a word can be challenging.
Talking about like the messaging part, so I'm trying to figure out in terms of progress throughout that entire time frame. I think we've seen from an organic perspective, we've seen like 1-2% of like the entire farming system is organic. So I'm guessing if we combine both, it could be around 5%. Why do you think we still have such a low adoption rate among farmers? And do you think those figures are accurate?
I'm not sure about figures. Figures in this continent part of the narrative. So anybody can make up these figures, and I don't trust also consultants to tell me about figures. They do easily extrapolate. If this figure is here, then da da da. So there's a lot of extrapolation. In terms of change, I think we have to go a long way. As much as agroecology is coming, the speed and the extent and the power of the green revolution is still there. That's what I have observed. Now, agroecology, people are saying agroecology, agroecology, agroecology. Why? As I said, most of external NGOs have come back and they're talking about agroecology, all the terms, climate smart agriculture, conservation agriculture, organic agriculture. Everything is changing into agroecology now. And also, more and more countries are increasing their funding to agroecology. I remember last year going to Bonn, and there was a presentation by BMZ, the German government's development arm. And BMZ, there was a presentation from an expert in BMZ, in the way they talked about agroecology is incredible. So it's going into the system, the funding system. And unfortunately, when it is in the funding system, then there are a lot of ears so everywhere, the external NGOs and local NGOs, even governments, listen. But what is agroecology, even what is the proper kind of regenerative agriculture, we have a long way to go. And the danger is very easy to be co-opted, You have to go and everywhere they say agroecology, you have to challenge them. Are you challenging power? Where is the social movement, This kind of question we have to ask.
Yeah, what's the biggest danger now in at this moment of agroecology sort of reawakening or getting attention? And what's the biggest risk of it getting more attention and more funding?
The biggest problem will be taking seeing agroecology as a technical solution. If you reorganize the certain principles of agroecology, there is a social side of it, participation, whatever, and there is a practical side of it, like biodiversity, synergy, soil health, whatever, So the focus now for most of them is on the technical, not on the people side of it. So that would be the danger. And our role is to bring in the critic. Every time our friends produce a paper on agroecology, then we pick and say, why are you talking about? What is a power analysis here?
Yeah, a friend of the show, Laura Ortiz, likes to say agriculture without the social side is just gardening. And keeps you like it is a tricky one. It is it's so much easier to not question the power dynamics and to just look at, okay, let's do a lot of mulching.
I agree. Yeah, now even increasingly governments and the number of institutions talk about food sovereignty. Even the African Development Bank, they had a meeting at the beginning of 2024. I think it's beginning of 2024 in Senegal. And in the title of the meeting, I think there's resilience and food sovereignty there. So for African Development Bank, food sovereignty is producing your own pesticides and agrochemicals, basically.
I think there's a lot of young people who follow you as well, who admire you in terms of your writing and your involvement within the African continent. And they sort of are interested in regeneration, they're interested in agroecology. What advice could you give to them if there was like one idea you could plant in their hearts for them to take for their future, like careers in the agroecology and regenerative space? What would you tell them?
Yeah, where I have a problem is it's very contextual, as you know. But I would say is one idea in general idea is there is business, there is entrepreneurship in the food system. I really advise them to look at it. That's why I also like the work of Rootical. They're trying as much as possible to open up people's minds, including youth, around agroecology and how the food system can provide jobs. Maybe that's what I wanted to say. And then the second one, probably maybe much more serious one, is your food, your traditional food is healthy, and it's your statement of being an African. Because when we eat our food system, we can save ourselves from so many miseries, including the influence from the ultra processed foods.
Not too much to add there. I mean, there's so many other questions we can ask, but we want to be conscious of your time as well. And thank you so much, of course, for the work you do and for biting into the food system, pun unintended, and to, of course, lead one of the largest civil movements in Africa and putting food and thus farming and thus civil society at the heart. And yeah, thank you so much for coming here and share about your work.
Thank you so much for having me again.